You're good to go.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Live from Home. My name is Brian Egolf, and I am the Speaker of the House in the New Mexico Legislature, and am very pleased that you're joining us for another edition of our Live from Home Town Hall series. We started these at the beginning of the arrival of COVID-19 in New Mexico, and all of us started quarantining or staying at home as much as possible. And we've had a great series of conversations about everything from COVID itself to school reentry, economic diversification, innovative ideas that are happening in New Mexico in aerospace and aeronautics. And today we are turning to what is sure to be one of the big topics in the upcoming legislative session because of the work of our guests this afternoon, and also because Governor Lujan Grisham has said that the legalization of recreational cannabis is at the top of her list for things to tackle in the 60-day session. So we know the governor is interested in getting this done. Polling suggests that a vast majority of the people of New Mexico want to see this happen for a variety of reasons that we'll discuss today. And we also know that great work from our guests that are here today also mean that this issue is going to be front and center during the upcoming legislative session. We are joined this afternoon by Representative Javier Martinez. He is a state representative from Albuquerque and is the chairman of the House Taxation and Revenue Committee. We also have Emily Kaltenbach. She is the state policy director for Drug Policy Alliance, which is a national organization. Emily runs the show for them in New Mexico and does a great job there. And so I'd like to start by asking Representative Martinez, Chairman Martinez, if he also, for folks watching who might not know, he has been at the forefront of the legalization conversation from the very beginning. He is a member of the governor's Cannabis Legalization Task Force and has been working through that group for a good part of last year and has picked up the baton to keep carrying the work forward as we head into this next session. And Emily has been part of that work as well. I think I'd like to start by asking Chairman Martinez to tell us a little bit about why legalization, why now, and what has the progress been like so far, and where we see things headed in the future. And then I'll go to Emily for maybe the same questions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the invitation to be here with you today. And Emily, great to see you. Thank you for all of the good work that you and your team do day in and day out. To your question, why legalization? Why now? The war on drugs has been a miserable failure. I think when you look at the criminal justice system, when you look at the economic impact, when you look at the violence from the drug cartels, the war on drugs has not resolved any of that. In fact, I think it's made things a lot worse. As this country moves toward a better understanding of cannabis, as public opinion shifts, particularly with the younger generations, I think we are in a very special place in terms of legalization, because New Mexico, given the experiences that we have, given the diversity in every way, shape, or form of our legislature, we have the ability to pass what can be a national model for legalization. Our legalization framework, historically, dating back to the days of former Representative Bill McCamley, has always focused on with sort of two foundational pillars. One of those is protecting and enhancing, where possible, our medical cannabis program. And that means making sure that we treat medical cannabis the way we treat any other medicine. That means protecting the rights of patients to be able to use their medicine in a way that is beneficial to them. That means ensuring that current medical producers that have invested so much time, energy, blood, sweat, and tears into this industry can participate in a potential in the new potential industry if they choose to. The second foundational principle of our legalization framework is racial equity. Let's not forget that the war on drugs has had a disproportionately negative impact on communities of colors across this country, whether it's African American, Native American, Latino populations. All of those populations have carried the weight of this failed war on drugs in a way that others haven't. And so in our legalization framework, since the inception, since the beginning, has always had a number of different elements to it that help build equity within that framework. You know, as a state, I don't think any of us that are proposing this are interested in legalizing for the sake of legalizing. We are interested in doing it in the right way so that our model can actually be a model for the rest of the country. We've learned the lessons of Colorado, we've learned the lessons of California, two states that legalize through ballot initiative. Quite frankly, there are a lot of gaps in their models, particularly with regard to medical and racial equity. We do not want to make those mistakes ourselves. We want to make sure that our framework is cognizant of those two foundational pillars and that we advance it in a way that respects those two.
That's great. Well, thank you. And it's a good framework. And it's also important to acknowledge that by not necessarily being first through the gate, we can gain from the knowledge and experience that other states provide based on their first experiences with legalization. Emily, I'll turn it over to you. Why don't you tell folks who are watching a little bit about DPA and what it is, what your work is here in New Mexico, and you know, I know that this has been a topic, not just legalization of recreational cannabis, but also your work on the medical program and other areas of criminal justice reform and reform of our drug laws generally. Why don't you tell us a little bit about DPA, what you're up to, and the work on legalization, but also the work on so many other things as well.
Right. Thank you, Speaker, and thanks for the invitation to be here. And thank you, Representative, for being so open to work with on these issues. It's been really great. Drug Policy Alliance, we are an advocacy organization, and we've actually been in New Mexico now for over 20 years, working on various drug policy reform issues. And really the underpinning and guiding principles around that prohibition has really created a lot of harm, right? And so how do we reduce the harm of prohibition, but also the harm of problematic drug use? And we know, living in this state, having grown up here, that there are a lot of harms with alcohol and drug use. And so our work spans from overdose prevention to drug education of young people, to legalization, and then also around, as you mentioned, criminal justice reform. That might look like how do we really treat addiction as a health issue and not as a criminal justice issue. And so really the public health implications of legalization is where we, and racial justice is where we come to this issue. Like the representative said, we shouldn't just be legalizing for the sake of legalizing. It shouldn't be because of a business interest. It should be really reflective of the needs of families and individuals in New Mexico. And the reason that Drug Policy Alliance really supports legalization is around reducing that harm and addressing the public health issues and the public safety issues. So we know that, you know, just the massive violence that gets created in an underground market, we need to reduce those harms, and legalization is a way to do that. Currently, our underground market doesn't curb youth access at all, and that's something we're deeply concerned about. And how do we create a piece of legislation that really helps young people not have access to cannabis and other drugs? And reducing like consumer protections is hugely important. I think we saw this play out with the vaping issue. You know, there was not long ago when people were getting really sick from vaping, and what they found out is that they were using products in the underground market. We need a tightly regulated market, and that translates into consumer protections and safety and public health. And so those are the real driving reasons that we are addressing this issue. And then, you know, above all is around the equity and social justice piece. You know, I think those are non-negotiable. Legalization must be rooted in righting the wrongs of the criminalization of cannabis in many of our communities that we know has impacted our Native and Indigenous communities, our Latino and Hispanic communities, and the Black community in New Mexico. And so we really need to look at provisions in a bill that right some of those wrongs and allow communities to participate in the industry. Because when you look around at all these other states, what we found is that big marijuana businesses come in, but it's not reflective of the communities. And so we'd like to see an industry that is reflective of New Mexico, that allows those small family farms to participate, that allows small business to participate. And so those are many of the reasons that we're supporting legalization this year.
Great. Well, thank you for your good and long work on the topic. You know, we do have lots of questions that have been queued up for us, but I think it'd be helpful for folks watching, whoever would like to talk about, you're mentioning the equity issues, and there's a really ugly history in the country going back to the Nixon administration of the use of the word marijuana and, you know, the use of drug laws to impact communities of color. I'm wondering, Representative Martinez, maybe would you discuss that a little bit for the folks watching who might not be aware of some of the history of this issue and how it's led to the development of a real systemic racism in our drug laws and criminal justice system?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question, Mr. Speaker. I think it's something that needs to be spoken about more often than not. As with a lot in our history as a country, the war on drugs was not immune to racism. You know, to put it very, very openly and directly. The war on drugs was a policy that was framed, that was developed, and that was deployed specifically targeting people of color. You know, it's no coincidence that many of the laws against drugs, if you will, were actually developed during the civil rights era. When you saw these coalitions of white Americans, Black Americans, Latino Americans, Indigenous Americans coming together to fight for the rights of all. And, you know, Nixon's so-called silent minority, or silent majority, I'm sorry, and the deployment of law enforcement in particular to target these communities through these very strict and oftentimes cruel laws led in many ways to massive incarceration of people of color that continues today. You know, Michelle Alexander wrote a wonderful book a few years ago called The New Jim Crow. And our prison industrial complex, in her words, it's sort of the continuation of that shameful Jim Crow period where, you know, after the abolishment of slavery and sort of after Reconstruction, you had these very, very cruel laws to keep African Americans from participating in society as full citizens. And the prison complex is a continuation of that with the war on drugs as a vehicle. Now, you mentioned the word, you know, marijuana. You know, the word itself has very racist origins. There are newspaper articles from back in the 1920s and 30s where strategically the word was used to scare what was then sort of your traditional white American family from the drug, right? And marijuana, being a Mexican word, Spanish word, was used to link cannabis to Mexican people. There's a whole host of articles, and at this point there are many books too that have been written. One in particular that I recommend to people when I talk about this is Chasing the Scream, which really looks at the history of the war on drugs, going back even before Nixon, to the days of J. Edgar Hoover and his FBI, and what they did to make drugs a problem of communities of color, and using their laws to inflict further harm on those same communities. So, the history is lengthy, it's convoluted, it's bloody, it's cruel, and to this day, we feel it. I can tell the two of you, before this, I drove to the bank, and I drove right through downtown Albuquerque, and you see the impact of the war on drugs on the streets of downtown Albuquerque. You see people of color who are on the streets with very deep issues that are generational, in many cases exacerbated by the war on drugs.
Yeah, it's Emily, you and I and the members of your coalition, we discussed this in my office before both of the most recent two legislative sessions about the idea of decriminalizing the possession of narcotics and what that would do to help people across the board, especially people of color in New Mexico, avoid the prison cycle or the jail cycle and all that does to force someone to lose a job, lose an apartment. Can you talk a little bit about that, about how these drug laws, especially laws that criminalize the possession of small amounts, what that does to individuals' ability to, make the rent, keep the job, it helps them pay the rent, put food on the table when they get thrown in jail for a 4 or 5 day period over a weekend before they can get arraigned. What is that? What are these laws? What does it really look like? Where the rubber hits the road, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, it's hugely devastating, not only to the individual, but to their whole family. I think we forget in New Mexico, if you just have a tiny amount of a drug other than cannabis, that's a felony in New Mexico. And that felony haunts you for the rest of your life. And it's not only that sort of the mass incarceration, fueling mass incarceration oftentimes, both in our local jails and our prisons, but it's also sort of the mass criminalization that happens. So that person then, as you mentioned, is loses their job, potentially loses their kids, can lose their housing. If they're young, trying to get student loans in the future is difficult. And so it's almost in the fact that that person is then criminalized for the rest of their life, because that arrest and charge follows them. And so and then also I think you and I had talked a little bit about just the fact that the habitual offender laws, right? And how that charge then becomes an addition, that time gets added on for having that small amount of possession. So if we could really pivot, and Portugal is a good model, but obviously Portugal is different than the US. But what they've been doing for a long time is really creating these dissuasion committees that look at the health issues versus locking that person up and expecting their behavior to change. And so if we could really invest in our behavioral health system, our harm reduction system, in our economic system, so that they're good jobs for folks, I think we'll see better outcomes. And in Portugal, over 10 years, they saw overdose deaths plummet. They were leading the European conglomerate of countries there, and so they saw public safety issues improve. And I just love to mention to viewers to keep your eye on the November election, because Oregon is actually it's something we've been working on at Drug Policy Alliance for many years. There's going to be a ballot initiative on the an initiative on the ballot in November, and that is to decriminalize drug use and possession and funnel people into a public health harm reduction system. We've already started doing that on some minor levels in New Mexico. I think people might have heard of the LEAD program, which is Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion. There's one in Bernalillo, there's one here in Santa Fe, Rio Arriba, Doña Ana, and now I think Taos is gonna start one. And the idea is that law enforcement has the discretion to say this person really should be diverted into an intensive case manager. And it's a pre-booking diversion, so it's before they're even booked into jail. That makes a big difference in that person's life. Just the fact that they get booked into jail and are charged with a felony, as you mentioned before, is just hugely damaging. So it's something that I think, and New Mexicans are with us on this issue. We're going to be releasing some polling on legalization in the coming week, which is very positive, but we also asked this question about decriminalization, and New Mexicans are in favor, and we've seen a huge jump in the last couple of years of people coming around on this.
And Emily and Mr. Speaker, if I may add too, New Mexico, we know we have, historically, we've had high rates of drug addiction and alcoholism. And we need to understand those substance use disorders for what they are. They are public health issues, public health problems. And these are issues that are many times generational, and they're tied directly to poverty and lack of opportunity. Cannabis is less harmful, toxic, a lot less lethal. I'm not even sure we could say it's lethal at all, than alcohol and tobacco. We know alcohol prohibition did not work. And so we tried it for a little bit, didn't work, we moved away from it. We know tobacco, we know the impacts of smoking or even using smokeless tobacco and how harmful it is. Yet as a society, we've decided at the federal level to legalize its use, to allow its use, to regulate it, to tax it, to try our best to keep our young people from using it, and to try our best to build public safety around the use of those two substances. Cannabis is no different. If there's a difference, is that cannabis is not at all as lethal as those two others. So, in a way, our public policy is now catching up to the science. It's catching up to what the science informs us about. And to be able to legalize, tax, regulate, to be able to recoup revenue from that activity and to reinvest that revenue in very much needed public health services is the smart thing to do.
I agree, and hopefully we'll get it done in this session coming up. Unless you have other comments you'd like to share before we go to questions, I did say we have quite a few, so maybe this is a good time to jump into one. Taylor Pass has a question about something that was in a previous version of the bill and is curious if it'll be included. The question is, quote, one of the features of the original bill is that Taylor thought would be most beneficial for New Mexicans was the opportunity for micro business licenses. There was also a section of the bill that would allow a portion of revenue from the cannabis excise tax to be appropriated toward funding low interest loans for New Mexicans seeking to start cannabis micro businesses. The question is, will either of these items be included in the next version, and whether or not there's been discussion of these two provisions since the bill failed to pass in the 2019 session?
So the short answer is yes. Those are two elements that we are very much, I think, committed to. For your viewers, I should add that we are in the process of redrafting the bill. And when I say redrafting, we're not rewriting the entire thing. I actually think House Bill 356 from 2019, the original 356, I think is a darn good bill. All credit to Emily and Jessica from DPA for all the work they put into that. That has become, I think, the vehicle. We retooled that last year for the Senate version of the bill we introduced, and now we are retooling that bill into a new version that will continue to include the micro business licenses, and that will continue to include some of the equity provisions within the revenue sharing part of the bill.
That's great. Emily, did you have anything to add on that, or shall we go to the next?
The only thing I'd add is that micro businesses and sort of scaling licensure and having different options is really important when it comes to equity. Other states have done this, and I think New Mexico is just going to follow in those footsteps. It's good public policy, but it's also about economic development and equity.
Thank you. Next, we have Linda Pafford. Her question is, please clarify the difference or differences between medical cannabis and hemp, and that the latter requires full legalization. Well, I'm not quite sure I understand the second part, but if you could clarify differences between medical cannabis and hemp, and sort of give us a lay of the land for hemp in New Mexico, and how the recent work that's been done on hemp has an effect on legalization of cannabis. Emily, maybe you have something. Maybe you could take that, because I know you've been really involved with the hemp legislation as well.
Yeah, I mean, we're really fortunate that the hemp legislation was passed, and now we're seeing the hemp economy in New Mexico, which is really, I mean, CBD has really just boomed, right? And so it's, I think, an important part of our economy. The difference between hemp and cannabis, that I mean, obviously it comes from the same plant, but hemp does not have the same levels of THC, which is the psychoactive compound in the plant. And so in order for hemp to be called hemp, it has to have a certain percentage, which is, I believe, 0.03, which then makes it hemp. And then if it's above that, it is classified right now under state law as an illicit substance. And so in the legislation of the past couple of years, that's really delineated, so that we're dealing with, in a sense, two different products. However, there's some similarities when it comes to testing and growing. And so I think there's a lot we can learn about the new hemp industry in New Mexico that can be applied to an adult use marketplace for cannabis.
Great. Let's see, Heath Greider asks about the prospects for bipartisan support of the bill that comes forward. I know that we have, heard claims of bipartisan sponsorship or bipartisan votes that have, I think, yet to materialize. So I think folks watching would be interested to hear from Representative Martinez about what the prospects look like for some bipartisanship on this bill going forward.
Well, I think if you look at public opinion, most Republican voters in the state support the concept of legalization. I've also anecdotally heard from some of the producers, medical cannabis producers, that one of the fastest growing areas in terms of medical cannabis patient cards has been in the southeast part of the state, which, as we know, is sort of a very Republican conservative stronghold politically. I would assume that in this year's version of the bill, we are very likely to get Republican support, particularly on the Senate side. We know there were a couple of senators from the Republican Party in 2019 who worked with me and worked with Emily and a few others on crafting that bill. And I would suspect that some of those folks would come around and support our bill this coming session. On the House side, and Mr. Speaker, you were here for that. You were there for that 3-hour debate on House Bill 356. It didn't materialize into votes, but we did have a good number of Republican House members actually speak very favorably about House Bill 356. They couldn't get themselves to vote for it. Obviously their party leadership with Steve Pierce is still, stuck in the early 20th century with regard to cannabis. And so some of them couldn't really get themselves to press the green button to vote yes on it. But I suspect that, they're going to be feeling pressure from their constituents. The polling that we're seeing is off the charts, as they say, with regard to support for this concept.
Well, we'll see if there's any proof in the pudding when we get to the vote counting. Let's see. Next, we have a question from Jason Barker with a question about the adequacy of the supply in medical cannabis and how the proposed legislation will or won't affect the supply of cannabis to medical cannabis patients.
Well, I can start, and Emily, if you want to chime in, please do so as well. This is a very important question. It's a very important issue to address. We heard from medical cannabis patient advocates in the past about that particular issue in other states. We are doing two things to sort of sweeten the pot, if you will. Number one, we are proposing to eliminate gross receipts taxes from medical cannabis and treat medical cannabis the way we treat every other medicine, which is not to tax it. That in itself should bring down the price of medical cannabis in relation to recreational cannabis, which under our bill will have anywhere between 16 and 20% tax on it. Number two, we are creating a cannabis subsidy fund that will help ensure that folks who are either low income or seniors or chronically ill patients can actually get some support from this fund to purchase their medicine. The fund would be funded through the, roughly 20% tax on recreational cannabis. So between those two, if you're a medical cannabis patient, you are actually encouraged to stay within the medical program and to, allowing the market in a way, if you're going into a medical cannabis dispensary, allowing the market to dictate whether or not these entities will be providing it. Now, keep in mind, as a framework, we want to be sure that medical cannabis patients are protected. I've heard from Mr. Barker, I've heard from others in the past that our legalization framework may not be as protective of medical cannabis patients. And we are working very, very hard to make sure that it is. We do not, and let me repeat this, we do not want to harm medical cannabis patients. That it's not something we want to do. Everything we're doing is, in fact, to support the medical cannabis system in New Mexico.
Thank you. Emily, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I'd add, as you mentioned, Speaker, we've been working on this issue for 20 years and helped draft and pass the Lynn and Aaron Compassionate Use Act. And so protecting patients is so important to us. So when I mentioned earlier, reducing harm also means reducing harm to the patient. And so I think the representative highlighted some really important provisions. If New Mexico does pass this with the low-income subsidy program, we'd be the first in the nation to do something like that for our medical patients. I think there are also some other really critical pieces around licensing, right? You want to incentivize the current producers to continue to provide medical. And so you don't want to see producers flee the medical system for the adult use system because they anticipate making more money there. So you have to look at licensing fees. You have to provide opportunities for current producers to stay producing to patients. I think it's really important that that supply and demand is monitored, and supply for patients is monitored. We don't want to have happen what happened in Illinois on day one, where you have a rush on product from people who are in the adult use side, and then there's no more product left for medical. So you have to really be setting up a system that protects supply. And so the timelines are really important in a piece of legislation. And then also making sure that certain products and the quality and potency of those products are still available for medical patients. There are some products that will never be sold on the adult use side, but there are a few patients in New Mexico who will need it. And so we need to make sure as we build out this legislation that we really are making sure, working with Department of Health, the patient registry would still stay at the Department of Health, that medical side. And that's really important because patients need to come first.
And I'll throw in something else to consider, and that is, having similar regulatory structures on both medical and recreational producers, right? If one is more tightly regulated or more strictly controlled than the other, that could encourage producers to move from one to the other to be in the easier regulatory environment. So that's something to consider for sure. Okay, next we have a question from a personal production license holder. This is someone who's licensed under the Lynn and Aaron Compassionate Use Act to grow their own cannabis for their personal use. It says they would like to know if there will be an increase in plant count, or will a nonprofit production license be expanded from the 23 for the general public? Will this person be able to produce and sell to dispensaries, and are they considering penalties that would be applicable to personal production license holders?
So personal production holders, license holders would remain the same under the version of the bill that we are working on. If you've got that license, you'll be okay. As far as being able to sell for retail or whatnot, in the bill that we do have what I think is a very, very smart micro business license. And under the draft that we are working off right now, that could include everything from seed all the way to sell for that micro business license, or it could include one piece of that process, right? So if somebody just wants to grow and that's it, they can do that as well. I think that's the beauty of the bill, the flexibility that we're providing for small operations, entrepreneurial type of things in this bill that was not necessarily included in previous versions of the bill.
Great. We've got several questions asking about the licensing process that you're planning to include in the bill in the upcoming session for recreational. The questions basically, we had 3 or 4 of the same type. The questions basically are whether or not currently licensed medical cannabis producers, are they automatically licensed for recreational, or do they have to go through the process on terms that are the same as anyone else who would want to apply for a license?
So the very short answer, and keep in mind, we're still drafting this, so I don't want to give the impression that this is set in stone, that we're proposing this. But number one, current producers, we would want to give them a bit of a step up, given that they're already in. They've invested over the last few years, so that they are able to shift or rather transition some of their operation into recreational. They would have to go in at this point and go through the process. The process, I should add, that we are envisioning is pretty streamlined. We don't want to recreate the same problems that we have with liquor licenses, for example, that, as we know, it's been a huge problem for economic development in many parts of the state. So it's a streamlined process. We would expect them to go through it. They would get a head start, if you will. And to Emily's point earlier about the timelines, that's very important because there's a growth cycle involved here, and we want to make sure that there is enough inventory to meet all of the needs of the public. But yes, the short answer is we do want current licensees to be able to participate if they choose to in the new framework.
We've got time for a few more. Here's a question about banking. What's happening around the country and what's happening in New Mexico with regard to cannabis-related businesses' access to the banking system? I know there's been lots of issues where cannabis companies have to operate on sometimes a cash-only basis or work with a limited number of financial institutions that are willing to open accounts for cannabis-related businesses. Maybe Emily, are there things happening in Washington? What's happening in other states with regard to access to banking?
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, Speaker, it's really a federal issue, right? And it's something that has been raised often in Congress in fixing the banking issue. So there's still banking legislation that keeps getting introduced. I mean, unfortunately, then, as you mentioned, the burden really falls back on states to figure that out. We've seen some amazing innovation, though, and even just here in New Mexico, I mean, it's the same with the medical system, right? So we've been dealing with that now for over a decade in New Mexico, and we've seen some credit unions step up and really support that industry. But until it gets fixed at a federal level, we have to be creative and innovative. And I don't know, Representative, you want to add some thoughts of how we can do it here?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, I think ultimately we all expect the federal government to move on this issue, and I suspect, of course, based on what happens in the election on November 3rd. Depending on who wins, we should be able to move the ball forward on this issue a lot more aggressively at the federal level. But, until the feds, I think, really step up to do the right thing, I think many of these business enterprises are going to have to, be as creative as they've been so far. So, and not to muddy the waters, but we are looking at some things for this new bill to help not directly address the banking issue. That's a federal thing, but certainly to help these businesses and these operations be able to deal in a more equitable way, if you will, in a more fair way with the feds with regard to income taxes and business deductions and whatnot.
Yes, 280E. So we have a question about what can we do in state law to protect employees with a medical cannabis card from some sanction or bad event at work resulting from their use of medical cannabis, a workplace that might have drug tests as a condition of employment. What can the state do to make sure that a medical cannabis patient, with a verified debilitating medical condition, doesn't suffer a consequence at work for the use of their medicine? I'm going to put that to Emily.
All right. Well, we did actually strengthen employment protections in the last, when we amended the Linen Air and Compassionate Use Act a few years ago. In the representatives bill in 2019, there was language that reiterated that medical cannabis patients shouldn't be discriminated against using. And so I think that's really important that we continue to include that language in a legalization bill to make sure that patients are protected. And I think it's important, I'll just share that I think people who would now use a substance that is legal should also have some protections in their workplace, like they would alcohol, right? That people shouldn't be fired for using, if cannabis is now legal in New Mexico, they shouldn't be fired for using it on off-duty times, as long as it doesn't impact their job performance. And so states are really grappling with this on, what's the right language, because we also want to make sure that our workplaces are safe, just like we would for any other substance that might, cause some harms to the individual or their colleagues. So finding that balance in language is really important. But I think that we need to make sure that medical cannabis patients are treated like any other patient. So if someone's in the workplace and they've been prescribed a pain medication, that should be no different than if they are prescribed or they have a medical cannabis card. And so we need to make sure that those protections are equal.
Thanks. I think we have time for one more here, and then we'll go to some final thoughts. So this will be a softball for you, Chairman Martinez. We have someone watching from home asking or letting us know that he supports recreational cannabis. How can he support you in your work, Emily's work, and how can he get behind and support passing your bill?
Well, obviously, make sure you've requested your absentee ballot and go vote, or go vote in person. Early voting started yesterday. In all seriousness, though, I think diversifying our economy, and we politicians talk about this all the time. And there are very few times when we have an actual opportunity to do that. This is one of those opportunities. And we can wait until we're the 49th state to do so, or we can do it now and be a leader. And I want us to do it now and be a leader. So for the viewer who's out there, please contact your member of the legislature. Please email them, call them, ask them to vote yes on this bill. Call coworkers, friends, colleagues who live in other parts of the state and have them do the same. The more that we can get people involved in this movement, I think the more likely it is that we succeed this coming year.
Great. And all of those email addresses and phone numbers are at www.nmlegis, that's nmlegis.gov. And you can get your name or your legislator. You can put in your address and it'll tell you who represents you in the state house and the state senate and what their email addresses are, as well as their phone numbers. And many of us have personal phone numbers up there as well. So we are very accessible. If you are a resident of New Mexico, you live in a state with really, I think it still has to be the most accessible legislature in the country. And it's very easy to get in touch with your legislator. So sharing your opinion on this or any issue is always not just important for you to do, but it's also important for the legislators to hear directly from you about what's important to you. So we'll wrap up with a few final thoughts. Emily, do you have any final words of wisdom or things to say to us before we sign off until next week?
Well, first of all, thanks, Speaker, and thanks, Representative, for your compassionate approach to legalization and really centering social justice and equity. I think that is critical. I think as we look to build this piece of legislation, I think we have to make sure it's protecting our kids, it's protecting our public health, also our natural resources. We didn't talk about that today, but something that's, a sustainable industry, protecting our roads, because we know how traumatized we are by accidents because of people who are driving while impaired. I think, we have to have that smart tax structure and revenue distribution plan, especially, making sure we're reinvesting back into the communities that have been most harmed. Making sure we have really a local industry, and how do we lift up small businesses? How do we let people who have had prior convictions, cannabis convictions, to be working in this industry? How do we create pipeline of young people who can be educated and certified so that they can participate in this new industry. So we have a workforce that is ready to start. And then, I'll end on just protecting our medical cannabis patients and how important that is. And I really believe that we're going to create the best piece of legislation that addresses all those key points. And so I'm just feel privileged to be working on this project and alongside some really amazing, compassionate folks. So thank you, Speaker.
Thank you. Chairman Martinez, any final comments or thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Emily. I always appreciate sharing the stage or the screen with you. Look, my mentor used to tell me that New Mexico is the land of mañana, right? The land of tomorrow, and we'll do it tomorrow. Whether it's policy, whatever it might be, we kind of tend to leave it till the next day. We have an opportunity to do something really special here. And I think that the legalization framework that we will be presenting here in the next few weeks, as I've said before, can be a national model because of the equity conditions, because of the protections for the medical program, because of the investment that it will bring to our state and the potential for our small businesses and entrepreneurs of any size to do something that can begin to diversify the economy and move us away from the whims of oil and gas. Obviously, as with any big piece of legislation, as with any big complex framework, there are a lot of T's to cross and a lot of I's to dot. Luckily, we have experts like Emily and her team. We have dedicated legislators like yourself, Mr. Speaker, and other members in our caucus who have taken this very seriously and have studied the issue inside out. We have a governor who is supportive, and not only supportive, but who has put her political weight behind it. We have the opportunity to do something very special in January of next year. And I hope that the rest of our colleagues will follow suit and that we deliver something big for the people of New Mexico.
Very well said. Thank you. And we'll look forward to a good session coming up. As we wrap up, I want to again thank Chairman Martinez and Emily from DPA Drug Policy Alliance for joining. Next week, we will be back Wednesday at 3. Our topic will be announced in the next day or two. So please stay tuned and please plan to be back here next week at Wednesday, back here next Wednesday at 3. And as we wrap up, I want to take a moment once again to remind everyone who's watching to please continue to be even more vigilant in our state's fight against COVID-19. It was announced minutes ago that we have 426 new cases reported today in New Mexico. Remember, just about 2 weeks ago, the case count was down in the 50s. So we are headed in the wrong direction. One of the ways to reverse this trend and to save the lives of New Mexicans who continue to be on ventilators in our state and who continue to be hospitalized every day. And sadly, barely a day goes by without several New Mexicans losing their lives to this virus. We must continue to wear masks when we go outside, stay home unless you need to be out, work from home if possible, avoid large gatherings, and please stay at least 6 feet apart from anyone who's not an immediate family member living in your home with you. But wearing the mask is critically important. We have a stark and sad reminder of that out of the White House this week and last week, but it's really important that we do this. We've got to get these cases turned around in New Mexico, especially because we're heading into the cooler months of the year when many more of us are going to be inside quite a bit more than we were in the summer. So it's incredibly important. So please, please wash your hands, stay a little bit apart, and please continue to wear your mask. The life that you save could be your own or that of a family member. So please stay vigilant. Please keep up the good work. Again, thanks to my great guests this afternoon. And until next week, God bless you all. Have a great week.